Welcome to our topic today, with or without you, leading the writing. Teresa is going to be our discussant today. She has had lots of experience in collaborative teams especially. And so I thought she would be an excellent person to talk to us about, being part of that team and taking that leadership role in it, whether she herself is the lead author or she is trying to lead the team, because we all play a role as leaders in whatever team we're in, even if we're not sort of the designated leader of a particular team. So Teresa, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask, what is it like being in the role of a leader for a team?
Yeah, so I think that because in actually, health professions scholarship, we tend to have larger writing teams. Like not all disciplines are like this. In some disciplines like law, it's like first author or nothing, or, like it's the reason why when Barack Obama wrote his editorial, for instance, in JAMA, I didn't think he made his own graphs, I'm just saying. But it was like first author, only author paper, because that's in law, that's what you do. And you footnote everyone and thank them for their help. But in their discipline, someone writes a whole book and you work your butt off helping them, with the research, and you write parts. But you'll be a footnote and a thank you and an acknowledgements on the inside, books section, right? And so you have to understand kind of like the culture of whatever academia that you come from. And sometimes for some of us who are cross-cultural or cross-disciplinary scholars, we will have to adhere to different rules of conduct within each of those. But in health professions, we tend to be fairly inclusive in our authorship. In fact, maybe not as inclusive as the engineers, where they had, I think, 300 or 400 people on the Higgs boson paper, but definitely, larger writing teams. And depending on the rarity of the disease, sometimes the writing teams are more than even the number of patients in the study. So it is possible to need a huge interdisciplinary team to make something happen because of the complexity of what we do. And so for me, leading the team is about making sure that you give some leeway to everyone and make that space for them to be able to qualify for the ICMJE criteria. So the ICMJE is a bunch of medical journal editors. They all got together and created a collaborative that actually put together criteria for what makes an author. And so it's important for those of you who are newer to writing to think about those criteria. And there's kind of like 3 main criteria, really 4 main criteria. And so I will kind of like bring those up in the screen for a second, and we can kind of go through them, because I think that they're so important that it's important to know how to get to the website. So I'm going to put in the chat the website, but also I will screen share and kind of take us through what you'll see when you go to the website. So as you can see here, it kind of talks about why authorship matters. And then the first section here is who is an author. And so there are 4 criteria that you have to be able to kind of meet. The first 3 are usually asked about, and the 4th one is kind of implied most of the time, but they've made it fairly explicit on their website. The first 3 are this: substantial contributions to the conception or design or acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data for the work. And so that's, something that I think is really important to think about, especially with empirical work. You will probably have to have some analysis regardless if it's like a commentary or something like that. And so the idea would be that people have to actually meet the criteria of adding something substantive to the actual paper and the work, right? So is that conceptual work where they kind of thought about the idea? Were they a clinician who gave insights onto what exactly was going on to interpret the findings, right? Someone's done a whole bunch of extraction, let's say for a scoping review, or gathered a bunch of data, and we now all stare at graphs and try to interpret what that means. So those are important for us to consider. Drafting or revising it critically for intellectual content, that's where it's really important as a leader for you to remember, okay, so they all kind of contributed, but did they get a chance to write or revise something? And so being tactical, being distributed, we talked about last time, but we can actually create the experiences that allow everyone to meet that criteria. The third thing is to make sure as a leader, you make sure that you you do actually engage everyone in a final approval of the version to be published. And so that means, even if you're corresponding author, making sure you float a copy of the, last penultimate draft, making sure that people got a chance to see the proof really quickly, even if you just give them 24-hour turnaround to get that back to you. I think that's really important. And the last part is the agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work, to stand by the work, to actually be part of the crew that stands behind something in terms of how accurate it is and how legitimate it is. And so the fourth one is kind of an understood thing. And so often in authorship agreements with journals, it's the first three that you have to substantiate because it's assumed that you're standing by your work that you're submitting, but it's important to have that conversation. And so if anyone finds that, this analysis is maybe skirting too close for my comfort, I think that when you're leading, you need to create that opportunity for people to speak up. And so there's many different models that you can use. I tend to like flat hierarchies. So having, the most junior person maybe do some of the emailing and empower them to boss us around, for instance. That's something that I often actually deputize some of the very junior medical students and empower them to say, okay, let's talk about your timeline. You need to get this on your CV for, like whatever career opportunity. Maybe it's that they're a resident or they're junior faculty and they're going up for promotion, whatever it is. I'll sometimes, meet with them, usually when I'm more of a last author, supporting that first author to be a good leader. Then we're a dyad. And we strategize and say, okay, look, you have your exam on this date. Let's avoid that being a critical point, or you can make that the deadline for everyone else to get their writing done. And then that way, when you're done your exam, you can flip over into editing, and that'll be great, right? And so we strategize timelines. I think it's about setting a pace so that there's a rhythm to it, because there's this sweet spot of if you give people not enough time, they won't do the work because you've given them no time. Like, let's say 2 hours notice, that's probably not going to get anything done. Even 2 days is hard for people, especially in the summertime. But if you make it 6 months, that's so far away that like the event horizon is just not, you can't see that part of your calendar in the immediacy. And so having checkpoints and milestones along the way, I think is really important as well, Ilana. So I think that those would be some of my tips for when you're leading a team, is to think through, what does that timeline look like? I usually suggest that you maybe no more than a month, the rule of thumb, to touch base with your team. And some of my really brilliant students have started taking to using calendaring to remind people of, when a section is due. They'll make a little calendar invite that's an all-day invite to get everything they needed to get done. And so it's there. They send everyone a calendar invite that you just populate into your calendar. And yesterday was a due date for one of the papers. And, we're just waiting for one person to write their section. But, she set an alert so that 2 days before the deadline, we all got a bing. And she didn't have to write an awkward email. It just was in the calendar. And she set it so that we were like, deadlines in 2 days, and the Google Doc link was just right there. And so whether you're using Microsoft products or Google products or Dropbox link, it was easy for us to go, okay, click and check on that paper and make sure we did everything. Within, the document, you can also, use comments and tagging functions to engage in conversation about things, give feedback. And one of my often collaborators, Michael Gottlieb, he's described in some of the other videos that we have on our library that he actually often pairs people up in dyads when he's getting people to write. So for instance, he'll have someone who's more experienced writing paired up with someone who's very junior and say, okay, look, the junior person takes the first draft, but Ilana, you're more senior. So if you can edit and nudge that person and meet with them even to write this section, right? And so that's very helpful as well. So I think, in the show ER, they talk about how as a leader, you set the tone. I think that you can actually bring that into writing as well. And so the idea would be, as a leader, you do set the tone. And so, being compassionate is also really important, and making sure that, if people do have a wedding or a funeral or just life getting in the way, that they should be entitled to their vacations, and negotiating those things and making it psychologically safe for them to actually put their hand up and say, actually, that's not going to work. So figuring out how you actually convene your team so that everyone feels that safety so that they can actually engage, I think is a really key part of that research leadership.
Yeah, I really like those tips. The one that's, I think, standing out right now for me is the the calendar invites for deadlines. Because I know with the overabundance of emails, things get lost and having to send those reminder emails. And then you don't see the reminder emails, but having it set as a deadline in your calendar, which many of us rely on our calendaring, I think is a great tip for going forward. So there's lots of great tips that you've shared with us, but I know that every writing collaboration does not run smoothly.
No.
What are some of the, I guess, most common challenges that you've had to deal with as a leader?
So I think that the most common challenges are when we're actually not on the same page. And so sometimes that's because we haven't had that awkward conversation that I encourage everyone to have. I call it the academic prenup, like getting the whole team together. Okay, who's on first? And having that question. And okay, Dr. Who, you are going to be first author. So what does that mean, right? Having that job description, having that discussion about how the med student is going to lead this project, and we're all going to say sir or ma'am, or we're just going to report to that person as if they are the boss, and to have that conversation up front. I think that that's important for us to calibrate the expectations, right? I think it's also important for that person to feel empowered and supported. And so often if someone's very junior is leading the team, then there's probably a second person that's like their really senior person that then pulls rank sometimes and nudges people and texts them and helps with that extra nudge sometimes to make sure that people do achieve the goals, right? It's kind of like having a unit commander who has a general backing them up, right? Like similarly here, I think you can have that. My superhero analogy is going to come out here. Sometimes Batman needs an Alfred who's keeping the lights on and keeping the Batcave warm for when he comes back. And that person needs to be, taking care of all the other stuff because the Wayne Mansion bills aren't going to pay themselves, right? And so in order for Batman to be Batman, sometimes someone has to be running kind of like the day-to-day interference in the background, right? And then I think there's other roles, right? And so sometimes, Batman's going to take on a Robin, someone who is like maybe like a junior faculty member will be mentoring a med student. And so the senior author role is really just to advise and make sure that relationship's going well, right? Because I think that often junior people are really excited to get involved, but they don't know anything and they're not ready to lead yet because they don't even know what a research project looks like. And so they're riding shotgun. And so you need someone that's a little more senior than them, maybe has done one or two more projects more, and can then be that first author and be the Batman. But then, someone's got to say, holy smokes, Batman, like what's going on here? And then Batman's got to reply, and then Alfred's got to roll his eyes and pay the bills. And so having that triad is helpful sometimes to imagine kind of your writing team of where you might position yourself. So if you're junior in your career, you got to go fight some battles before you can have the credibility to be a superhero. So develop your skills, devote your time to that. Don't go and have Robin run the show when you don't even know what you're doing, right? And so I do encourage junior faculty to take on at least one or two projects to feel like they're confident in leading research before they move to a second author or last author position. And then as you're supporting people, you carve out your niche in mentoring and that can be a form of leadership as well. And I think that you also need to develop your followership, right? And so when you're a guest star on someone else's superhero movie, you can be a good follower to check in with your leads and say, hey, I haven't heard from you in a while. Like, are we hitting their targets? Can I help with any other sections? Right? Really staffing up to meet the expectations, but then maybe exceed them a little bit. Because if everyone does that, then all of a sudden the team is stronger. Right? And so I think that that's some pro tips that I have for both the problems which can occur, which is that we're not really sure what we're doing. So that's a common problem. Another one would be that someone tries to take on too much when they're too junior. And they don't have the right support, which we see quite a bit. And then I think it's about the followers that sometimes just are like ghosting you until you call them to arms. And so if there can be mandatory checkpoints, if there can be other things that you just actually pull into that. I think about, again, I'm going to continue with the DC comics because I usually talk about Marvel and I'm going to show some love to the other side. But, Wonder Woman was not really the star of the Justice League. It wasn't her movie, but she's a really good, like leader follower in that situation. Cause she was like, okay, guys, like stop fighting. Like we got to figure this out. And so sometimes the middle people have less skin in the game, but they can be that person that sheds light on a problem or a dilemma and calls the meeting as well. Right. So I think that we can empower everyone to be part of that, even though some people are going to have certain stakes that they follow, especially at our institution. First and last author are really important compared to the middle author positions. But as you get more senior and more experienced, or you're guest starring in someone else's, if you're watching a train wreck happen as a healthcare scholar, it might be better for you to yell stop and keep the train wreck from happening, and actually help out to resuscitate the project, because I think that's the right thing to do. And so I think we can do that a little bit as good team members.
Yeah, and that aligns with the thought of that we all bring in leadership qualities, whether we're the leader of that team or not. And, thinking about the song which we played today, and it's, kind of sort of loosely connected in a way, but to me, it does have some connection, the with or without you. What happens when you're leading a team and, really then it becomes you as the lead to kind of push things through? How do you deal with that, trying to get your team back together or on board? So it really isn't with or without you, but it's with you.
Exactly. And I think that that's where the leadership really comes in, right? Because I think that's why we picked the title, and that with or without you title is because the paper the project needs to be done. There's a granting agency, there's deadlines, and the project needs to be carried through. But how do you then actually inspire your team to come with you? And I think that comes from a couple of things. I think it comes from having clear expectations, like I said, who's on first, who's on last, who's doing what job, setting a common timeline that everyone gets to weigh in on, everyone gets to put together kind of like an agenda as to the timeline that they can spend, letting there being some room for negotiation so everyone can actually hit the target, and being empathetic and understanding. I think it's about making sure that you do set some milestones and guidelines, right? So phasing out the research. So it's not just like, okay, write the paper now. It's okay, so we're all agreed on the timeline. Great. Next thing is that we're going to all look at this outline together. Great. All right. We have 2 weeks to look at the outline. Everyone drop your comments. Everybody add citations. Everybody do their thing. Make sure the logic works, right? Okay. Now we iron it out. And now we assign sections. Okay. Ilana, you're on this. I'm going to pair you up with Joanne, because Joanne's a med student and she doesn't know how to write this section yet, but she's going to watch you write it and then she's going to edit it for you. Cool. But Joanne's going to do this part because we've got the study protocol and she's going to write the methods. She's going to take future tense and turn it to past tense. I am sure that Joanne has the intelligence and the capabilities to do this, but Ilana, will you look it over with her, make sure she truly understands the methods, because she has to meet that 4th criteria, right? And then we assign all those roles. Sometimes you do as a pep talk if you're more of a Ted Lasso character and really want to just like get everyone inspired and like get everyone all together. Sometimes if you've worked with that team dozens of times, it could be as simple as a Slack message or an email. And so I think that's what you can do, or like tagging them on the Google Doc, right? And so those kind of things can be helpful. And then after that, it's kind of like that, I guess we're doing the Olympics right now. So I'll drop in another analogy. It's like with the rowers, there's someone, calling the shots, beating the drum, right? If anyone's ever done dragon boat racing, there's someone beating that drum that's going to help you keep the beat. And so having a leader that can do that is really important, because then we're all on the same page. We're not like having our oars in different parts and we actually move together. And so once you've written the parts, now it's time to tell everyone, hey, it's time to edit. And you rally the troops and you say, okay, let's edit now, right? Let's all take a look. We've all done our first round of editing. This is last looks. This is our, refinement section. This is where you really need to be cruel to be kind. You got to find the spots that the reviewers are going to find, and we're going to have to take each other to task. Sometimes I even have a dedicated member who's usually a middle author or senior author, whose job it is to be the red team. And the red team member is someone who is like an internal editor that helps with like the early conceptualization, but hasn't really been part of the writing yet until this point. And then we give them full license to turn on track changes and just go to town. And some of them are legendary. Like, if you come to the next session, John Charbonneau is legendary. He broke Google Docs one time. Like, he had so many edits that like we still make fun of him for it. And now it's on record. But like, he literally had so many track changes that Google was like, no, this is impossible. We can't keep up. And so what we ended up doing was actually copying and pasting the text and then just redoing them manually and putting them back into a new Google Doc because he broke that one. I think it's still rendering right now. I still get emails about that paper, and we've moved on. We've submitted it. So there are some technical things, but having someone that's willing to really give you that honest opinion about the writing, to really interrogate and edit, I think that's really, really good, strong contribution, right? And then the ICMG criteria, that is critically revising, right? The document, and that is an authorship role, right? Like, you can have people who write, but then there are people who critically revise. And so really empowering that person to go to town, right, is something that you can really do as a leader. And sometimes you need to have a conversation to calibrate them. Some people they like margin comments, but like my team doesn't like margin comments. So we had to like ease someone in one time. We had to like, okay, so you do a lot of margin comments. We're like, fix the grammar. I'm like, but that's what track changes are for. So we need you to turn on track changes and just fix the grammar, because clearly whoever wrote this couldn't see it. So why are we wasting everyone's time with like, guess what I'm thinking? Just tell us what you wanted to change. And if we don't agree with you, we'll argue with you in the comment margin, right? And so I think it's about creating those structures and making sure everyone understands the technology so that they can fully use it. And sometimes that's part of the barrier, is that depending on where your colleagues are, if they're in a Wi-Fi, like down spot, they don't have the capability to be able to get the, fiber optic cable. There might be reasons why you need to send them like a carrier pigeon with a USB key so that they can actually like open the file. And so for those people, you might want to save them for the red team, because then they can just go to town on a Word document, and that's okay. Right. Most people don't need to print stuff out, but some people actually work better that way too. So it might be that you need to understand how every member of your team works, what their superpowers are, and then you can allocate them to a good part of the writing team and be able to kind of be that strategic person within the team.
That's great. There's so many great tips and strategies that have come out through today. And I'm even thinking back to some of the sessions that we've had before and things that Teresa has reflected on and brought forward. And I'm thinking this may actually lead up to sort of a scholarly writing guidebook of, kind of tips and strategies along the way. And so I think that might be something that we look forward to putting together. And I'm going to open it up now for any comments or questions for Teresa before we break into our writing for today.
Oh, we have Verily. Go ahead.
Thank you for this presentation. I was wondering, because I'm new to qualitative research, and when you do a project, there is a long period where you code the data and you come to new meanings emerge, and only a limited number of people can do that. So the rest of the team, I'm working within a mixed team with quantitative researcher. When you integrate their input after that, because this interpretation evolves greatly during the coding part. So what are your milestones or timeline, or how do you bring them back into such a project so everybody agrees in the end at the analysis part?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a big part of it is that if they're pure quantitative people, you may need to like actually do a bit of a mini orientation to what process you've done. And so it's almost like you do like an internal research presentation. Like you can sometimes time it to be around the time you're going to submit to an abstract anyway, so that you can come on side. The other thing that I can suggest would be you could have them do some level of an audit trail where they can become immersed in one transcript, for instance, and then read that and then read your final code and map it back to make sure that you weren't kind of getting too far off of where the data truly is, right? Like they should still be able to see, like in this transcript, that it maps to the conceptual framework or the theoretical work that you've actually generated. Let's say you're doing grounded theory, like you will have something that you've created as a mid-level theory. So each transcript should be able to be seen within that theory. And if it's not, you should give them permission to like be like, and then you should convene the team to have that conversation again. Because sometimes when you're interpreting, sometimes you've gone so far that you can't see the transcripts in there anymore. And that's important for you to have new eyes look at it. And so some people engage in that kind of audit trail and look at memos and look at data and then look at one or two transcripts to see if it's still reflected. Similar to the way that some people do a member check with people who were participants to say, do you see yourself reflected in this final analysis, right? The other thing that I sometimes do is actually I save some of here are 5 options for quotes for this section. And I have them vote on the best quote, for instance, right? Because that to me is still substantive decision-making about the data that you're including. And then another thing to remember is that they can critically revise, right? And so they don't have to do the writing, they might do the critical revision. And hopefully they were involved at the very beginning with the design anyway. And so they would have helped you define the universe in which you're studying. They would have helped you maybe refine some of the research questions. Maybe you could have like piloted the survey tool or the interview guide or the focus group guide on them so that for clarity. And so they've all been part of the design process. And so I think it's about folding in their involvement all the way along. Even if they're not qualitative experts, they can do parts of that work. And then I think that they have to buy in to what you're selling at the end. So they have to believe in that 4th criteria. They have to believe in the actual substance within the paper. So making space for that.